Thank you. Welcome to the first remote interview as part of the International Growth Center's IGC move for celebrating Africa Industrialization Day. If Africa Industrialization Day was actually commenced by the United Nations General Assembly, which was proclaimed 20th of November as Africa Industrialization Day, which started in 1990. Since then, the United Nations system has held events on that day throughout the world to raise awareness about the importance of Africa industrialization. According to the United African Union, AU, the day represents a unique platform to enhance international cooperation and dialogue on the Pan-African industrialization agenda and to raise awareness of the opportunities and challenges associated with innovation and driving industrialization. My name is Veronica Masubo, and I'm a policy economist at the International Growth Center, and I'm also one of the main thematic leads on driving research and evidence on industrialization and trade. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. Carlos Lopes is a professor in the Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. He's occupied several leadership positions across the UN system, including Policy Director for Secretary General Kofi Annan and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. He's also a member of the African Union Reform Team led by President of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, and doubles as the organization High Representative for Partnership with Europe, as well as a member of the Global Commission for Economic and Climate, African Academy of Science, and Lisbon Academy of Sciences, and the boards of African Leadership Institute and the Geneva Graduate Institute. So Dr. Carlos, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I wanted to start just to ask you a couple of questions. It'll just be three. So first one is about recovery policies in regarding the COVID-19 and the economic crisis. So just to start off, looking at the COVID-19 crisis, it's been quite unprecedented and has resulted to global and simultaneous shock to supply and demand triggered by the coronavirus, which is deeply affecting African economies. According to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the best case scenario for Africa would be to see the continent's average GDP growth for 2020 fall by 1.4 points, which is equivalent to the loss in GDP growth of 29 billion in 2020. In a worst case scenario, the projections indicate Africa's economy contracting by up to 2.6% in 2020, equivalent to a loss in GDP growth of 120 billion. So reflecting on some of the policies that exist in the continent that are aiming to contain the impact of COVID-19 on the crisis of economies in Africa, what national and regional responses have been appropriate and timely, would you say, Dr. Carlos?
Well, I would say that the resilience of Africa in relation to the sanitary dimensions of this crisis has now been recognized. What is less recognized is the fact that the response capacity being relatively fragile for most African countries, still the leaders in the continent have been capable of actually being quite steadfast in providing solutions that have proven to be the right ones, basically various measures relating to lockdowns and confinement that have created the conditions for the infections not to spread as much as people feared. And the mortality rates have been quite low. But what people talk less is the fact that all of this has created quite a significant impact on socioeconomic terms, particularly related to the informal sector. As we know, Africa modernization of its economies is a work in progress. We have not yet attained a level where we can say that most of the economic structures respond to the majority of the population. And as a result, you have quite a significant impact resulting from informality. And I think confinements and lockdowns created really an amazing demonstration of the fragility of people's conditions. But what I'm also very interested is the fact that most of the activities in the industrial sector, since it's Industrialization Day, have been deeply affected by this crisis. We have witnessed in a number of value chains significant reduction of activity because of logistical problems, because of other measures that have affected deeply and disrupted deeply the manufacturing, particularly in the areas and sectors that are most integrated in the global value chain, such as automotive industry, textiles. And this is really a matter of concern because it basically points in the direction of a very negative year, not only in 2020, but also most likely in 2021.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos. That's very insightful. So then just going into the role of industry and manufacturing, even with economic growth rates exceeding 5% experienced in most African countries before COVID-19, manufacturing has not yet been the driver of growth. According to the World Bank, in 2020, 52% of the total workforce are found to be in the agriculture sector, which is followed then by 37% of the total workforce in the service sector. So going forward, what do you think is the role of agriculture, industry, and services in achieving industrialization and job creation in Africa?
I think first we have to admit that the statistics and data in Africa are quite poor. And as a result, there is a lot of speculation about what is exactly the proportion of the industrial sector in the economies. My research demonstrates that actually in terms of per capita, we have seen an evolution of the manufacturing value addition over the last 20 years that is quite significant, from 156 US dollars in 2000 to about 196 US dollars 2 years ago. So that is significant. We can also see that there is a sort of stability in terms of the manufacturing value addition in the composition of GDP. But what we talk less is the fact that, you know, the economies in Africa have grown quite significantly. We have almost doubled the size of the economy since the year 2000. Therefore, you know, just maintaining that stability means that the industrial sector, you know, in terms of absolute contribution to the economies, have also doubled their size. And this is important to say because people talk about structural transformation imperatives that include, obviously, the move of the labor force from agriculture to more productive sectors in the industry at a time where we have characteristics that are quite different from previous industrial waves. Africa is facing its industrial acceleration process under conditions that are quite different, and therefore we should look into an experiment that is going to be also significantly different from what we have observed historically. For instance, the fact that the industrial sector now is very much linked with the service sector. So we cannot just resume value addition to the traditional manufacturing role, but also, you know, look into the links between some value chains that comprehend both the traditional industrial sector and the service sector. So the division is a bit more fluid. Second, we have a demographic curve that is quite important to bear in mind because it's taking place, this demographic transition, at a time where the rest of the population of the world is aging. And as a result, you know, you have characteristics that are very peculiar to Africa. And finally, the technological developments that we are witnessing are, of course, transforming completely the way we deal with industrialization, but also giving opportunities for leapfrogging that didn't exist before. Like, for instance, on the area of energy and infrastructure, we can now introduce, you know, sustainability dimensions that were not available before, or when they were available, rather, it was very expensive. So they're very competitive now, and Africans can just jump the queue. So I think if you bear in mind all these characteristics, you will then realize that the contributions of the industrial sector in Africa have actually been quite significant, and talks about premature deindustrialization are highly exaggerated. when papers and the literature started, reflecting about premature deindustrialization in the world, they picked Africa as one of the examples, one of the demonstrations, because the peak of costs of the labor were being attained much earlier than in other regions of the world. What is not taken into consideration is and this is partly because of the poverty of the data, is the fact that we have also a certain number of elements that are quite different, and even with the characteristics of premature deindustrialization that have been observed in the literature, if you have samples that cover the entire continent, you see a diversity of situations, and we tend to have a much broader perception of the evolution of this particular sector that is less influenced by the 3 or 4 countries that normally are studied, like South Africa, Egypt, and sort of the most industrialized ones. So you'll get a completely different picture and a much more positive one in terms of evolution.
Thank you, Dr. Carlos. I like the fact that you said that we're looking at industrialization in Africa in quite a different perspective. And I think it's very important that you highlighted the challenges of data, and that sort of pushes in to give a narrative that's not quite what may be happening in the continent. So just to finalize some kind of question with everything that we've discussed, my last question would be, thinking beyond COVID-19, what do you think are the key strategies and priorities that governments, or at least AU as a general, should go forward for in order to achieve growth and industrialization in Africa? So post-COVID-19 recovery and so for the future.
If we accept that we are going to have a very different acceleration of industrialization from other previous waves, we still have to admit that there is a lot of learning that we can take from those previous waves. For instance, in terms of agricultural productivity, we know that the link with industrialization is very strong for structural transformation, and we have not paid enough attention in Africa to this link. So we tend to see agriculture and industrialization back to back, but not necessarily as a continuum. And we need to change that perception. In terms of policy interventions, we need to make sure that agro-processing is our #1 priority for industrialization. There are lots of reasons that militate in favor of agro-processing. First, the fact that we have what it takes. We have the land, we have the water, we have the means, and we have a very young population. We have a growing consumer market, and we have more protection from the global value chains when it comes to agro-processing, because the more sophisticated the value chain is, the more difficult it will be to find the windows of opportunity. Whereas backward and forward linkages in the agro-processing sector can remain within regional value chains, or for larger countries in Africa, even within national value chains. So this is really a winner. And it's also a winner because the consumer market is going to be, progressing. We know that the middle class in Africa is growing. We know that disposable income is also growing. And the first line of consumption, when you actually are just out of poverty or you have a bit of means, is actually processed food or items that have, that are related to the agro-processing value chains. So I think this is really a winner. And obviously, we have some soft commodities that will benefit from this as well. If you talk about cocoa, if you talk about coffee, if you talk about cotton, all these different soft commodities, they actually, can be much more valued if we put more emphasis on some value addition beyond what is exported raw right now. The second priority, in my view, is to make sure that we don't see our natural resources, our commodities, as necessarily a curse. There is no stigma associated with natural resources bounty. We create that stigma with bad policies. So the problem is not the richness of the natural resources creating the difficulties, is bad policy. So how do we change that in order to make sure that we take advantage of the fact for some commodities we are in a position of basically negotiating much better the terms of trade. There are a number of very strategic commodities, including for the new technologies, including for the new forms of use of energy, renewables, that depend heavily on highly concentrated in Africa extractive potential. And I think, you know, Africa is not taking advantage of that. Talk about cobalt, to talk about coltan, talk about all these materials that are very key for the new industries. And now, even when we talk about the renewable energies, there is a lot of mentioning of hydrogen. Hydrogen, you know, it's really better captured in terms of link between ocean and desert. And the best places for all of these are in Africa. So we have to make sure that we take advantage of these opportunities and transform our commodities into propeller of our industrialization by adding value. And if we just add about 10% value to the current commodities we export, including oil, that can be refined and then taking in a completely different perspective for more African consumption. Africa consumes 70% of its refined products from imports, which is absurd. And then you have 40% of our exports are in oil. So all of this has to be translated into policy that is much more conducive to helping these different commodities establish value chains in Africa. And with about 10%, as I was mentioning, you can create about 5 million jobs a year. So this is really very important. And then the third priority is probably, export-oriented manufacturing. But we have to do it with a lot of care, because what is going to happen is that you have aging of the population in traditional export hubs like China. But you have also the competition of automation, robotization, and soon artificial intelligence that is going to create a completely different type of manufacturing. So Africa will have to position itself to be basically taking over a certain type of production, but with the technological sophistication that comes with, being a latecomer. Latecomers don't need to go through the full cycle of mistakes that others have gone through. Latecomers can take advantage and by leapfrogging, but obviously this requires a lot of smart interventions and a lot of sophistication that is going to be available only for a few African countries, not for all. And we have already demonstrations that this is possible, from aeronautical industry in Morocco to the high-tech industry in South Africa and Nigeria to some forms of garments, sophisticated production in countries such as Ethiopia and Kenya. So I think we really have what it takes to use this opportunity, but with a few countries more than the entire continent. So I think these are the three basic priorities for us to be able to accelerate our industrialization.
Thank you so much. That was so super insightful. I do like the discussion that's actually going on right now about looking back in agro processing and sort of really rethinking that and sort of not alienating it away from the discussion industrialization. So I appreciate that you discussed that as well. I mentioned it from another speaker as well. So just to summarize your point, so the three things that you were mentioning that will be really key in terms of driving industrialization post-COVID-19 are sort of looking at natural resources and really making sure that we develop industries around them and develop jobs around them, really rethinking our agriculture, agro-processing policies, and making sure that the linkages and sort of developing regional value chains around that as well, which there's so much more opportunity. And then lastly, is to look at sort of certain sectors within certain countries in the continent, and sort of rethinking manufacturing itself and how we're gonna orient that towards exports. Do you have any final words that you would like to add into to this discussion?
A very important point, that all of this is based on one premise, and the premise is that we are going to be able to establish a regional market. With our free trade area that is under construction, we can actually create the architecture for that to happen by protecting our value chains as much as possible. You know that we have now intellectual property regimes that suck most of the value and are highly skewed in terms of where it's concentrated. We have logistics that have become much more important than the value of the production itself, because logistics is becoming extremely automated, and it's the sort of the frontier for the introduction of new technologies. That's why companies like Alibaba or Amazon are making a lot of money out of COVID and all the crises of the world. So we come from a position of weakness when it comes to logistics. And finally, we have also, the regimes of international trade that are much more tightened than they were when others industrialized. So, which means that we have to negotiate very smartly. And it's very difficult for us to negotiate as 54. It's much more wise for us to go as one and be able to negotiate with the key partners of the continent, like the European Union, like China, like the US, like Japan and others, as one. And this is now possible because of the free trade area. And if we really put what it takes in terms of policy support, in terms of regional integration, in terms of regional infrastructure projects for us to basically translate the aspiration of the free trade area into something that is really conducive to developing regional and national value chains, then what I just mentioned as possibilities make sense.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carlos. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.